Rain hammered against the windows of Iron Horse Bar as the last customers of the evening crowded around worn wooden tables. Neon lights flickered across bottles lined behind the counter, casting long shadows across the room. Most people inside were laughing, drinking, and trying to forget whatever burdens they had carried through the day. Nobody paid much attention when the front door opened, at least not at first. Then a woman stepped inside. She moved slowly, not because she lacked confidence, but because every step demanded precision. Her left sleeve hung empty beside her body. Her right hand gripped a single crutch that supported what remained of a life forever changed by war. Beneath dark jeans, a prosthetic leg disappeared into a worn boot. She paused just inside the doorway, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light. For a brief moment, the conversation softened. A few heads turned. A few people stared. Most quickly looked away. The woman seemed used to that reaction. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She did not seek attention. She never had. She only wanted a quiet seat, a warm drink, and a few minutes of peace. At the far end of the bar, a young bartender named Emily noticed her immediately. Emily had seen many customers walk through those doors, but something about Sarah felt different. There was no self-pity in her face. No bitterness. Only a calmness that seemed almost impossible. Emily offered a polite smile. Sarah returned it with a small nod and slowly made her way toward an empty stool near the corner. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the laughter returned. Yet not everyone had looked away. Near the center of the room sat 5 bikers wearing leather jackets covered in patches. Loud, arrogant, and already several drinks deep, they occupied the largest table in the bar as though they owned the building. Their leader sat with one arm draped over the back of his chair, watching Sarah cross the room. His name was Rex Carter. People in town knew him well, not because he deserved respect, but because he enjoyed making sure everyone feared him. Rex narrowed his eyes as Sarah moved carefully between the tables. Something about her irritated him instantly. Maybe it was the crutch. Maybe it was the missing arm. Maybe it was the quiet dignity she carried despite everything she had lost. Whatever the reason, his expression slowly transformed into a grin. The kind of grin that usually meant trouble. Sarah reached the corner stool and carefully lowered herself onto it. Emily approached and asked what she would like. Sarah ordered coffee. Nothing stronger. Emily seemed surprised. Most people came to Iron Horse for alcohol. Sarah simply smiled and said she had a long drive ahead of her. Emily nodded and walked away. For a few seconds, peace returned. Sarah looked out the rain-covered window and appeared lost in thought. She seemed far away from the noise surrounding her, far away from the laughter, far away from the memories she carried. But across the room, Rex never stopped watching. One of his men noticed and followed his gaze. Soon the entire table was looking in Sarah's direction. A few whispered comments were exchanged, then a few chuckles, then louder laughter. Sarah heard them. She had heard similar laughter countless times before. She ignored it. She always did. Yet Rex interpreted her silence as weakness. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table. The grin widened. Around him, his men sensed entertainment coming. Emily returned carrying Sarah's coffee. As she set the cup down, she noticed Rex staring. A knot formed in her stomach. She knew that look. Everyone in town knew that look. Trouble was coming. Sarah wrapped her hand around the warm mug and quietly thanked her. Emily hesitated for a moment, almost saying something, almost warning her, but stopped herself. Sarah simply sat there, calm and composed, unaware that she had already become the target of the most dangerous man in the room. Or perhaps she was aware. Perhaps she simply did not care. Across the bar, Rex slowly pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. The laughter around his table faded into anticipation. Several customers noticed and looked away. Others pretended not to see. Nobody wanted to be involved. Nobody wanted Rex's attention. He took one slow step towards Sarah, then another, and as he stared, directly at the lone crutch beside her stool, a cruel smile spread across his face. Rex Carter did not hurry across the room. Men like him rarely hurried when they believed the whole room already belonged to them. He walked slowly, letting his boots strike the wooden floor hard enough for people to hear him coming. Each step carried a message. Move aside. Stay quiet. Do not interfere. The conversations nearest his path died one by one. A man at the pool table lowered his cue. Two women at a corner booth stopped laughing. Emily stood behind the counter with one hand on the coffee pot, watching Rex approach Sarah with the kind of dread that settled in the stomach before a storm broke. Sarah did not turn around immediately. She lifted her cup with her right hand and took a slow sip of coffee. Her face remained calm, not blank, not frightened, calm. That bothered Rex more than fear would have. Fear gave him power. Fear gave him a room to perform in. Sarah gave him nothing. He stopped beside her stool and leaned slightly forward, close enough that his shadow fell across the counter in front of her. The smell of whiskey and rain-soaked leather followed him. Behind him, his four men spread out casually, blocking the aisle, smiling like they were watching the beginning of a show. Rex glanced down at the empty sleeve on Sarah's left side, then at the prosthetic leg beneath the counter, then at the crutch resting against the stool. He let the silence stretch long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he said, loud enough for half the bar to hear, "War took its time with you, didn't it?" A few of his men laughed immediately. Not because the line was clever, but because Rex had spoken it. Sarah kept her eyes on the cup. Emily's jaw tightened. Someone near the jukebox muttered under his breath, but no one moved. Rex turned slightly toward his men, enjoying the reaction, then looked back at Sarah. What happened, sweetheart? Did the battlefield win, or did it just leave enough of you to crawl back? The laughter grew louder. A chair scraped somewhere across the room as a customer shifted uncomfortably. Sarah set the coffee down with careful precision. The cup made a soft sound. Against the wood. She still did not look at him. Rex frowned. He wanted anger. He wanted tears. He wanted her to snap back so he could turn the entire room against her. Instead, she acted as though his words were insects tapping against glass. He reached toward the crutch and tapped it lightly with 2 fingers. The metal clicked against the stool. Sarah's hand tightened once around the handle of her cup, so briefly most people would have missed it. Rex noticed. His grin returned. There it is, he said. Found the button. Emily stepped forward from behind the bar before she could stop herself. Rex, leave her alone. The room seemed to inhale. Rex turned his head slowly toward Emily, and the young bartender immediately regretted speaking. His eyes hardened. You running a charity shelter now, Em, letting broken soldiers drip misery on the floor. Emily swallowed, but did not answer. Sarah finally turned her head, not toward Rex, toward Emily. Her voice was quiet. It is all right. Emily stared at her, confused by the calmness. Sarah looked back at her coffee. Rex laughed, pleased by what he believed was surrender. See, even she knows better. He dragged a chair from the next table and planted it in the narrow space between Sarah and the exit, blocking the path she would need if she wanted to leave. Then he sat backward on it, arms folded across the backrest, studying her like a cruel child studying an injured bird. So what are you supposed to be, he asked. Some kind of war hero. Sarah did not answer. Rex leaned closer. Come on. Everybody loves a story. Tell us how you lost the arm. Tell us how you lost the leg. Or is that too much woman for one question? His men exploded with laughter. Emily looked down, furious and helpless. At the far side of the room, an old man sitting alone near the wall paused with his glass halfway to his mouth, but Rex did not notice him. Sarah did, only for a second. Then her eyes returned to Rex. For the first time, she spoke directly to him. Her voice remained low, steady, and controlled. Move the chair. Rex blinked, then smiled wider. Not a request in your condition, is it? Sarah looked at the chair, then at him. Move the chair. Rex's smile thinned. There was no pleading in her tone, no checking, no fear, just command. That made the room feel colder. Rex's men stopped laughing for half a second, not because they understood her, but because something in the way she said those words did not belong to a helpless woman. Rex heard it too, and it wounded his pride. He stood up suddenly, knocking the chair back with his leg. You think because you got some scars, everyone has to bow. He stepped closer and nudged the tip of her crutch with his boot. The crutch shifted an inch. Sarah's eyes dropped to it. Then she lifted them back to Rex. Her expression did not change, but her voice cut through the noise like steel drawn slowly from a sheath. Do not do that. Rex looked around at the room, inviting everyone to enjoy the moment with him. If I do, what are you going to do about it? Sarah held his gaze. For the first time all evening, even the rain against the windows seemed quieter. She answered with 5 words, flat and certain. You will wish you had not. Rex stared at her. For one brief second, something passed across his face. Not fear, not yet, but irritation sharpened by the feeling that he had just touched a wire he could not see. Then pride took over. His jaw tightened. His hand reached toward the front of her jacket. For a moment, nobody moved. Rex's hand remained suspended in the air between himself and Sarah, and the tension inside Iron Horsebar seemed to tighten like a cable pulled to its limit. Rain continued striking the windows outside, but inside the room, every sound suddenly felt distant. Sarah's words still lingered in the air. You will wish you had not. They had not been spoken loudly. They had not been delivered with anger. Yet somehow they carried more weight than a shouted threat. Rex hated that feeling. Men like him built their lives around control. The moment they sensed someone refusing to fear them, something ugly awakened inside them. Rex slowly lowered his hand and laughed. It was not genuine laughter. It was the forced laugh of a man trying to convince himself that he was still in charge. His men joined in immediately. The room followed their lead with nervous smiles and uncomfortable chuckles. Nobody wanted to be the only person taking Sarah seriously. Rex pointed toward her with one finger. Hear that, boys? She says I'll regret it. One of the bikers slapped the table and laughed. Another raised his beer. Maybe she's some secret assassin. The group erupted again. Sarah remained seated. Her coffee had gone untouched since Rex approached. Her posture stayed straight despite the missing arm, despite the prosthetic leg, despite the eyes of nearly every person in the room fixed on her. Emily watched from behind the counter. She had expected Sarah to look frightened by now. Most people did. Instead, she saw something she could not explain. Sarah looked tired. Not physically tired. Tired in a deeper way. Like someone who had already survived things far worse than this room could imagine. Rex stepped closer again. You know what your problem is? Sarah did not answer. Rex smirked. You think those scars make you special. You think people owe you respect because life hit you harder than everyone else. Sarah finally lifted her eyes to meet his. No. The single word was calm. Simple. Certain. Rex frowned. Then what exactly are you trying to say? Sarah studied him for a moment. Around them the room fell silent once more. Even Rex's men seemed curious about her answer. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that people leaned forward to hear it. I'm saying you're confusing injury with weakness. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Several customers exchanged glances. Rex's smile disappeared. His pride heard an insult, even though Sarah had never raised her voice. Injury with weakness, he repeated slowly. Then he laughed again. That's rich coming from someone standing on one leg. A few men laughed with him, not as loudly as before. Sarah never looked away. That irritated him even more. Most people dropped their eyes when confronted. Sarah did not. It was not defiance. It was certainty, and certainty made insecure men dangerous. Rex leaned down until his face was only inches from hers. Let me explain something. In this town, I decide who's weak. Not you. Sarah looked at him quietly. Then she said, something that none of his men expected. No, you decide who's afraid. That's not the same thing. The words hit harder than a punch. Several customers immediately looked away. Emily froze. One biker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Rex's face hardened. Sarah had just done something few people ever managed. She had embarrassed him without raising her voice. For the first time all evening, his men stopped laughing completely. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Rex straightened. His jaw tightened. Fine, if that's how you want to play it. Sarah reached for her coffee again. The gesture seemed almost absurd, as though she were more interested in finishing her drink than continuing the conversation. Rex watched her hand close around the mug. Then his eyes drifted toward the crutch beside her stool. The single piece of equipment that allowed her to move independently. The single object she relied on every day. And suddenly a cruel idea formed in his mind. His expression changed. Emily saw it immediately. Fear clenched inside her chest. She knew that look. It always appeared just before Rex crossed the line. Sarah appeared to notice it as well. Yet her face remained calm. She slowly placed the coffee back on the counter. Rex followed her gaze downward toward the crutch. Then he smiled. There it is. Sarah said nothing. Rex took one step closer. Then another. His boot stopped beside the crutch. You really think you're tough, don't you? Sarah answered immediately. No. Rex blinked. Then what? Sarah's eyes never left his. I think you're about to make a mistake. One of the bikers laughed nervously. Another shifted in his chair. The room had changed. The entertainment they expected no longer felt funny. It felt like standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. Rex refused to feel that uncertainty. Pride would not allow it. He looked around the room and saw people watching him, waiting, judging. The realization made him angry. He needed to reassert control, needed to remind everyone who owned the room, needed to break something. His gaze returned to Sarah, then to the crutch, then back to Sarah again. The decision was made. Slowly, deliberately, Rex reached down toward the crutch. This time he was no longer pretending. The moment Rex's hand closed around the crutch, the atmosphere inside Iron Horsebar changed. Until then, everything had still carried the illusion of being a cruel joke, a bully showing off, a drunk biker entertaining his friends. But the instant his fingers wrapped around the metal support that Sarah depended on every day, something crossed an invisible line. Emily felt it immediately. So did several customers sitting nearby. Even some of Rex's own men shifted uneasily in their seats. Yet Rex seemed energized by the discomfort spreading through the room. He tightened his grip on the crutch and lifted it slightly from the floor. Sarah's eyes followed the movement. Her expression did not change, but for the first time a shadow appeared behind her calm gaze. Not fear, not panic, recognition. The recognition that a man determined to prove his power was about to humiliate himself far more than anyone else. Rex smiled. Look at this, he announced loudly. The mighty war hero can't even stand without a piece of metal. His men laughed. The sound felt forced now. One customer quietly stood up and moved toward the far side of the room. Another stared down into his drink. Nobody wanted responsibility for what was happening. Sarah remained seated. Carefully, deliberately, she placed her coffee cup back on the counter. Emily watched every movement. Sarah wasn't trembling. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging him to stop. Somehow that made the situation feel even worse. Rex raised the crutch higher. Tell me something, he said. Did they give you this after they ran out of metals? A few scattered laughs followed. Sarah looked directly at him. Put it down. Her voice was calm. Rex laughed. Or what? Sarah held his gaze. Put it down. For a second, something inside Rex seemed to hesitate. Then the room reminded him of its existence. Dozens of eyes were watching. Pride took over. He tossed the crutch from one hand to the other like a toy. The movement drew a sharp breath from Emily. Stop it, she said. Rex ignored her. Sarah slowly shifted her weight, preparing herself in case she needed to stand. Rex noticed. His grin widened. Then he suddenly stepped backward, carrying the crutch away from her reach. Laughter erupted from his table. Sarah remained seated. Her jaw tightened slightly. That tiny movement was the first sign that his behavior had finally reached her patience. Rex saw it and mistook it for weakness. There it is, he said. Finally, I knew there was a limit somewhere. He swung the crutch lazily through the air. The metal reflected the neon lights above the bar. Around the room, people watched with growing discomfort. A middle-aged truck driver shook his head. A young couple quietly left cash on their table and moved toward the exit. Emily felt anger rising inside her chest. Yet fear kept her frozen behind the counter. Rex loved that fear. He fed on it. Then his eyes shifted toward Sarah's jacket. Dark, worn, unremarkable. He had noticed it earlier, but ignored it. Now another cruel idea formed. Without warning, he stepped forward and grabbed the front of the jacket near the collar. Emily gasped. Several customers immediately stood up. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Let go," she said. Rex smiled. "Make me." The room went silent. Rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere near the back wall, a glass tipped over and shattered against the floor. Nobody looked. All eyes remained on Rex and Sarah. Rex tightened his grip and pulled hard. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the room. The jacket ripped open across the front seam. Gasps spread through the crowd. Emily covered her mouth. Sarah was jerked forward on the stool, but managed to keep her balance. The damaged jacket hung unevenly from her shoulders. Rex released it and stepped back, laughing. His men joined him. "There. Now everybody gets a better look." The laughter echoed across the room. Sarah slowly adjusted the torn fabric with her remaining hand. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, dignified. She refused to give Rex the reaction he wanted. That refusal infuriated him. He had expected outrage. He had expected humiliation. Instead, he saw only restraint. The same restraint that had haunted him since the moment she walked through the door. Emily could barely breathe. Every instinct told her to call the police. Yet she also knew help would arrive too late. The damage had already been done. Rex stared at Sarah. "Why aren't you angry?" Sarah looked at him. "Because men like you mistake anger for strength." The answer landed like a slap. Several customers looked away. Rex's smile vanished. His face reddened. The room felt smaller, tighter, dangerous. For the first time all night, Rex stopped trying to entertain the crowd. This was no longer about making people laugh. It was personal. He looked down at the crutch still hanging from his hand, then back at Sarah, then down at the crutch again. The cruel idea that had started as a joke suddenly evolved into something worse. Something irreversible. Slowly, deliberately, he wrapped both hands around the crutch and tested the metal with a twisting motion. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds inside Iron Horsebar were the rain striking the windows and the faint creak of metal as Rex twisted the crutch between his hands. What had begun as mockery no longer felt like entertainment. Even the bikers sitting behind him seemed uncertain now. There was a difference between making jokes and deliberately destroying something a disabled person depended on. Yet pride had already pushed Rex too far to stop. He looked directly at Sarah while slowly increasing the pressure. Almost everyone in the room understood what he was about to do. Emily certainly did. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Sarah remained seated. Her torn jacket hung unevenly across her shoulders, but her posture remained straight. She watched Rex without blinking, without pleading, without negotiating. That calmness irritated him more than any insult ever could. "Say it," Rex demanded. "Say you're sorry." Sarah said nothing. Rex tightened his grip. The metal frame groaned softly. "Say you were wrong." Still nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Sarah spoke. Her voice was low, quiet, steady, the kind of voice that forced people to listen. "This is your last chance to stop." A nervous laugh escaped one of the bikers. Another looked away. Rex heard neither of them. His attention remained fixed on Sarah. Last chance. The phrase echoed. Inside his head, to him it sounded ridiculous. He saw only a disabled woman sitting alone in a bar. He saw a missing arm, a prosthetic leg, a torn jacket. He saw weakness because weakness was all he understood. The possibility that he might be wrong never crossed his mind. Rex smiled. Then he twisted harder. A sharp metallic crack exploded through the room. Several customers flinched. Emily gasped. One side of the crutch bent violently. Rex looked down and laughed. "You hear that?" He twisted again. Another crack echoed through the bar. This time louder, more final. The damaged support folded under the pressure. Metal snapped. The crutch broke into two useless pieces. For 1 second, nobody reacted. The sound itself seemed too shocking to process. Then silence fell across the entire room. Absolute silence. Rex held the broken halves high like trophies. His men tried to laugh. The sound died almost immediately. Nobody else joined them. The victory he expected never arrived. Instead, a strange feeling settled over the room. Disappointment, disgust, embarrassment. Sarah lowered her eyes toward the shattered crutch. For the first time all evening, something moved behind her calm expression. Not fear, not anger, sadness. Brief. Controlled. Gone almost instantly. Yet Emily saw it. And somehow that tiny glimpse hurt more than any tears would have. Rex stepped closer. What's wrong? Nothing clever to say now. Sarah slowly placed her hand on the edge of the counter and began to rise. Without the crutch, the movement was difficult. She shifted her weight carefully, relying on the strength she had spent years rebuilding. The damaged stool scraped against the floor. Several customers instinctively moved as though they wanted to help. None did. Fear still held them in place. Halfway to her feet, Sarah lost balance. The broken support was gone. Her body tilted sideways. She caught herself for a moment. Then gravity won. She fell hard against the wooden floor. The impact echoed through the room. Emily covered her mouth. A woman near the entrance turned away. One of the bikers stopped smiling completely. Sarah remained on the ground for several seconds. Not because she could not move, because she chose not to rush. Slowly, she pushed herself upright using one hand. Every motion required effort. Every motion carried dignity. Rex expected humiliation. Instead, he found himself staring at determination. Somehow that made him even angrier. He threw one half of the broken crutch onto the floor beside her. Then the other. There. Now we're even. Nobody laughed. Not a single person. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting. Sarah looked at the broken metal lying beside her. Then she lifted her eyes toward Rex. There was no hatred there. No panique. No defeat. Only disappointment. The expression unsettled him more than rage ever could. Because disappointment implied judgment. It implied she saw him clearly. And what she saw was not impressive. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. She had witnessed cruelty before. She had witnessed drunken fights. She had seen people humiliated. But this felt different. This felt like watching someone kick a memorial, destroying something that represented years of survival, years of recovery, years of pain. Sarah drew a slow breath. Then another. Around the room, customers avoided eye contact with one another. Everyone knew a line had been crossed. Nobody knew how to uncross it. Near the back wall, the elderly man who had remained silent all evening slowly lowered his glass onto the table. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, more specifically on something that had shifted when she fell, something partially hidden beneath the torn edge of her jacket, something most people never noticed. His expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. The room remained focused on Rex and Sarah. Nobody noticed him stand. Nobody noticed the glass trembling in his hand. Nobody except Sarah. Their eyes met for a brief second across the room. And for the first time all evening, Sarah seemed to understand that someone had finally seen what Rex never did. The silence that followed Sarah's fall felt unnatural. It was no longer the silence of spectators watching a confrontation. It was the silence that comes after witnessing something that should never have happened. Rex still stood in the center of the room, holding on to the illusion that he had won. Yet even he could feel that the mood had shifted. Nobody was cheering. Nobody was impressed. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the consequences of what he had done. Sarah remained on one knee beside the broken crutch. Rainwater drummed against the windows while the neon lights reflected across the polished floor around her. For a brief moment, she simply breathed. In, out, slow, controlled. The same way she had learned years ago whenever pain threatened to take control. Emily wanted to run around the counter and help her up. Every instinct screamed at her to do it. Yet fear still chained her feet to the floor. Not fear of Sarah, fear of Rex. The same fear that had controlled everyone in that room for years. Sarah finally reached toward one half of the broken crutch. As she moved, the torn edge of her jacket slipped farther open. A thin chain hidden beneath her clothing caught the light for a fraction of a second. Almost nobody noticed. Almost. At the back of the room, Frank Dawson noticed immediately. The elderly Marine veteran had been silent throughout the entire confrontation. He had watched, listened, judged. Until now, he had convinced himself Sarah was simply another wounded veteran trying to live a quiet life. But when that chain appeared, something deep inside his memory stirred. Frank leaned forward in his chair. His breathing slowed. The chain itself was ordinary. Old, worn, tarnished by time. What hung from it was not. A military identification tag, burned along one edge, scarred by heat, half destroyed, yet still recognizable. Frank narrowed his eyes. No, he whispered. It couldn't be. Across the room, Sarah noticed him. Their eyes met for less than a second. She immediately understood what he had seen. Frank's pulse quickened. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered his glass onto the table. Around him, nobody paid attention. Every customer remained focused on Rex. On Sarah. On the broken crutch lying across the floor. Frank barely saw any of it now. His entire attention locked onto the damaged identification tag hanging beneath Sarah's jacket. Memories long buried began surfacing. Military, briefings, stories told in quiet voices, names spoken with respect, names most civilians had never heard, names connected to missions that officially never existed. Rex took a step towards Sarah. You should have listened, he said. His voice lacked confidence now. The room could hear it. Sarah did not answer. She simply adjusted the torn jacket, instinctively trying to hide the chain again. The movement came too late. Frank had already seen enough. He slowly stood from his chair. Nearby customers glanced at him in surprise. Frank rarely moved quickly. Tonight, he rose so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound turned several heads, including Rex's. The biker frowned. Something wrong, old man. Frank ignored him completely. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah. The expression on his face had changed. Confusion, shock, disbelief, respect, all mixed together. Sarah gave the smallest shake of her head. A warning, a request. Please don't. Frank understood immediately, yet he could not stop staring. His heart pounded harder with every second, because he was no longer asking himself whether he recognized the tag. He was asking himself whether the impossible was standing right in front of him. Emily noticed the exchange. She followed Frank's gaze towards Sarah's torn jacket. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then the chain moved again. The damaged tag slipped partially into view. Burn marks covered one corner. Scratches covered the surface. Most of the engraving had been destroyed, but not all of it. Frank took one slow step forward. His lips parted slightly. The room seemed to narrow around him. Sarah lowered her eyes. For the first time all evening, she looked tired. Not defeated, just tired. Like someone who had spent years trying to leave the past behind only to watch it catch up once again. Frank could barely breathe. A single fragment of lettering remained visible beneath the damage. 3 letters, then a number. Small, faded, nearly erased, but still there. 7. Frank froze. The glass slipped from his fingers. It struck the floor and shattered. The sharp crash echoed through the entire bar. Every head turned toward him. Even Rex looked. Startled. Emily jumped. Several customers stood. Frank stared at Sarah as though he had just seen a ghost. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Just once. When she opened them again, she already knew what would happen next. Because Frank Dawson was no longer looking at a disabled veteran. He was looking at a name he had not heard in over 15 years. If stories about courage, sacrifice, and ordinary heroes still matter to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we share powerful stories that remind us never to judge someone by what we see on the surface. Now let's continue Sarah's story. The shattered glass remained scattered across the floor, but nobody moved to clean it. Nobody seemed capable of focusing on anything except Frank Dawson. For the first time all evening, the center of attention shifted away from Rex Carter. The biker felt it immediately. One moment he had controlled the room. The next, every eye was fixed on an old Marine standing motionless near the back wall. Frank barely noticed the attention. His entire world had narrowed to the damaged identification tag hanging beneath Sarah's torn jacket. His breathing had become uneven. Memories were surfacing faster now. Fragments of conversations, classified briefings, stories whispered between Marines who thought nobody else was listening. Stories that had survived because soldiers never completely forget the people who saved their lives. Rex frowned. What the hell is wrong with you, old man? Frank didn't answer. He took another slow step forward. Sarah watched him carefully. There was no surprise in her face. only resignation. The kind of resignation carried by people who know a secret can stay buried only for so long. Emily looked between them in confusion. She could feel something changing, but had no idea what it was. Around the room, customers exchanged uncertain glances. The atmosphere no longer felt dangerous. It felt historic, like everyone had accidentally walked into the middle of a story that began years before they arrived. Frank stopped several feet from Sarah. His eyes remained fixed on the tag. Finally, he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that?" Sarah lowered her gaze briefly, and she looked back at him. "You already know." The answer hit Frank harder than he expected. His throat tightened. For years, he had believed the stories were exactly that. Stories. Legends exaggerated by time. Yet standing before him was living proof that some legend survived. Rex laughed loudly. The sound felt forced. "Are we seriously doing this?" Some old war story. Nobody paid attention to him. That irritated him immediately. He stepped closer. Frank ignored him completely. Instead, the old Marine slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a worn leather wallet. From inside, he pulled a faded photograph protected behind cracked plastic. His hands trembled as he stared at it. The photograph showed 9 Marines standing in desert camouflage. Young, dust-covered, smiling despite exhaustion. Frank looked at the image, then at Sarah, then back again. Emily noticed tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Is it really you?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the photograph. A shadow crossed her face. Pain, memory, loss. Then she looked away. Frank took that as an answer. His breathing became shallow. "Dear God," one of the customers near the bar finally spoke. "Who is she?" Frank looked at him, but seemed unable to find words. How could he explain? How could he explain 15 years of stories, rumors, and military legends to people who had never worn a uniform? Rex folded his arms. "This is ridiculous. She's nobody." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Frank's head snapped toward Rex. For the first time that evening, anger flashed across the old Marine's face. Nobody. The word came out harder than expected. Several people turned toward him in surprise. Frank took another step forward. His eyes never left Rex. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The confidence in Rex's expression flickered. Only for a second. Then arrogance returned. "I broke a crutch. That's what I did." Frank stared at him. Then he laughed once. A humorless sound. "No, that's not what you did." Silence filled the room again. Sarah lowered her head slightly. Emily felt her pulse quicken. The old Marine's reaction carried more weight than anything that had happened so far. Frank looked back at Sarah. The respect in his eyes was unmistakable now. Years ago, he said softly, there was a story every Marine knew. Not officially, not in reports, not in newspapers. Just stories passed from one Marine to another. Rex rolled his eyes. "Here we go." Nobody listened to him. Frank continued. A team was ambushed, cut off, outnumbered, communications destroyed. Most people believed nobody would make it out alive. Several customers leaned closer. Emily unconsciously stepped out from behind the bar. Even Sarah seemed uncomfortable hearing the story begin. Frank noticed. He immediately stopped himself. "No, not yet." He shook his head. "This wasn't the place. Not now. Not like this." Sarah looked relieved. Frank understood. The details could wait. But one thing could not. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement instantly caught Sarah's attention. Her expression changed. "Frank." Her voice was calm but firm. "Don't." Frank looked at her. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then he answered quietly. "I have to." Sarah's jaw tightened. She already knew who he intended to call. Across the room, Rex smirked. "Calling for help, old man." Frank didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on Sarah. Because this was no longer about a bar. No longer about a biker. No longer about a broken crutch. It was about a debt that had remained unpaid for 15 years. Frank slowly unlocked his phone. His thumb hovered above a number he had not used in nearly a decade. Around him, nobody understood why his hand was shaking. Nobody understood why his eyes had become glassy. Nobody understood why a retired Marine looked as though he had just found a ghost. Nobody except Sarah. She recognized the number before he pressed it. She recognized exactly who would answer. And for the first time all evening, genuine concern appeared in her eyes. Because once that call was made, the past would no longer stay buried. Frank Dawson stared at the phone in his hand for several long seconds. Around him, the entire bar seemed suspended in time. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. Even Rex Carter remained unusually quiet. Something fundamental had changed, and everyone could feel it without understanding why. Sarah understood. That was the problem. She knew exactly what would happen if Frank completed the call. 15 years of silence would come crashing back into her life. 15 years spent avoiding interviews, ceremonies, reunions, and military events. 15 years spent building a life away from the shadows of a single night that had changed everything. She looked directly at Frank and shook her head once more. Please. The word was soft, almost lost beneath the sound of rain against the windows. Frank's expression tightened. Sarah rarely asked for anything. Even now, after everything Rex had done, she wasn't asking for justice. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking him not to weigh ghosts. But Frank could no longer pretend ignorance. Not after seeing the tag. Not after seeing her. Not after watching a gang leader tear apart the dignity of someone who had once sacrificed more than anyone in that room could imagine. Frank drew a slow breath. Then he pressed the call button. Sarah closed her eyes. Across the room, Rex rolled his eyes dramatically. This is unbelievable. A few of his men laughed nervously, but the sound quickly faded. Nobody else joined them. Emily watched Frank carefully. The old Marine's hands were still shaking. Not from fear, from emotion. The phone rang once, then twice, then 3 times. Each ring seemed louder than the last. The room listened despite itself. Nobody knew who was on the other end. Nobody except Sarah. And even she wasn't certain the number still worked. It had been years. Then suddenly the call connected. Frank straightened instinctively. The change in posture was immediate, almost military. Hello. His voice became more formal than anyone had heard all evening. There was a pause. Frank listened. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah. Finally, he spoke again. Sir, I think I've found her. The words landed heavily inside the room. Emily felt a chill run through her body. Found her. Not met her. Not seen her. Found her. As though someone important had been missing. As though someone had been searched for. Rex frowned. One of his men shifted. Uncomfortably, Sarah lowered her head. On the other end of the line, silence followed. Long enough to make Frank swallow hard. Then a voice answered. Nobody else could hear it, but everyone could see its effect. Frank's face changed instantly. Shock, relief, disbelief, respect, all at once. Yes, sir, Frank said. I'm certain. Absolute certainty. Sarah closed her eyes again. She knew that answer. She knew exactly what question had been asked. Frank's certainty left no room for doubt. The person on the other end wasn't asking about the tag. He was asking about her. Rex crossed his arms. This is ridiculous. Emily ignored him completely. The rest of the room did the same. Frank listened again. Then his expression became even more serious. He turned away slightly, lowering his voice. She doesn't want me to call. Another pause. Frank listened, then nodded slowly. I understand, sir. Sarah's jaw tightened. She knew that tone. She knew the answer before Frank spoke it aloud. Some orders were impossible to refuse. Frank looked directly at her. His eyes were apologetic. Then he said the words she had feared hearing. He's coming. A wave of confusion moved through the bar. Who's coming? Emily looked around. Nobody knew. Rex laughed loudly. Finally, maybe whoever this is can buy her a new crutch. Nobody joined the joke. Not one person. Frank ended the call and slowly lowered the phone. His hands were no longer trembling. Something had changed inside him. A burden had lifted. Sarah studied his face. She saw certainty there now. The certainty of a Marine who had finally completed a mission he didn't realize he was carrying. Frank slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked around the room. Every eye was on him, every ear waiting for answers. But he refused to provide them. Not yet. A young customer finally spoke. Who is she? Frank looked towards Sarah, then back at the crowd. His voice was quiet. The wrong question. Confusion spread immediately. What does that mean? Frank exhaled slowly. The question isn't who she is. The question is who she was willing to become for other people. Nobody understood. Nobody except Sarah. She looked away toward the rain-covered window. The old pain had returned. Not physical pain. Memory. The kind that never completely disappears. Emily stepped closer. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Is someone really coming? Frank nodded once. Yes. Emily swallowed. Who? Frank hesitated. Then a faint smile crossed his face. Someone who has waited 15 years to say thank you. Sarah immediately looked down. The room fell silent again. Even Rex didn't know how to respond to that. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Inside, something else was approaching. Something bigger than everyone in the room. Something set into motion 15 years ago. And for the first time all evening, Rex Carter felt a small, unfamiliar sensation growing inside his chest. Unease. After the phone call ended, nobody in Iron Horse Bar seemed willing to speak above a whisper. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, people had been watching a disabled woman being humiliated by a gang leader. Now they felt as though they were standing at the edge of a mystery they didn't understand. Sarah remained seated on the floor beside the broken crutch. Emily had finally gathered enough courage to leave the safety of the counter. She knelt beside Sarah and quietly helped position a chair nearby. Sarah accepted the gesture with a grateful nod, but said very little. Her attention remained fixed on the rain-covered window, almost as if she were watching memories instead of weather. Frank Dawson slowly returned the old photograph to his wallet. His hands had steadied, but his eyes remained distant. Every Marine carried certain stories for life. Stories that never appeared in history books. Stories repeated around campfires, inside barracks, and during long deployments. Some stories became legends because they inspired hope. Others became legends because nobody could explain how they happened. Sarah belonged to the second kind. A young man sitting near the bar finally broke the silence. Who is she? The question echoed through the room. Several people nodded. Emily looked at Frank. Even Rex watched him now. Frank exhaled slowly. 15 years ago, he began, there was a team operating in a region most people never heard about. Officially, nothing happened there. Unofficially, it was hell. The room became completely silent. Frank wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't need to. Every person in the building was listening. A Marine team entered hostile territory on a recovery mission. 9 Marines. Good men. Experienced men. The kind of soldiers who usually came home. He paused. His eyes drifted toward Sarah. This time they didn't. Emily swallowed hard. Frank continued. They were ambushed. Communications failed. Air support never arrived. The enemy knew exactly where they were. One by one, those Marines fell. The customers exchanged uneasy glances. Even Rex seemed uncomfortable hearing the story. Nobody expected a war story to emerge from a broken crutch and a torn jacket. Frank looked down briefly. The official report listed the mission as a failure. The newspapers never covered it. Most people forgot it ever happened. But Marines didn't forget. Sarah shifted slightly. She still didn't look at anyone. She knew where the story was going. She had lived it. Frank looked toward the damaged identification tag hanging beneath her jacket. There was only one survivor. A woman. Young. Stubborn. Too brave for her own good. Emily glanced toward Sarah. For the first time, she stopped seeing a disabled stranger. She began seeing a soldier. Not a victim. Not someone broken. A soldier. One of Rex's men finally spoke. If she survived, what happened to the others? Frank's jaw tightened. They survived too. Confusion immediately spread through the room. I thought you said only one survivor. Frank nodded. One survivor capable of walking away. The rest survived because she refused to leave them behind. The room fell silent again. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. She hated this part. Not because it was untrue, because it was incomplete. Hero stories always left out the fear, the screaming, the blood, the impossible choices. Frank continued. She moved from one Marine to another while enemy fire closed in. She dragged men twice her size across open ground. She carried ammunition, treated wounds, kept people alive long enough for extraction. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even shifted in their chairs. Frank's voice had become the only sound in the room. At one point, he said quietly, she could have escaped. She had a route out, a chance to save herself. Sarah lowered her head. Frank looked at her. She refused. Emily felt tears forming again. Why? The question escaped before she realized she had spoken. Frank answered without hesitation. Because there were still Marines behind her. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Several customers looked down. A woman near the door wiped at her eyes. Even some of Rex's bikers seemed unable to meet each other's gaze. Frank continued carefully. That's where the story started. Nobody knew her real name. Most Marines only heard a call sign. A name passed from unit to unit. A name attached to impossible survival stories. Sarah immediately looked up. Frank. He stopped. The room froze. Sarah's voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Please. Frank stared at her for several seconds, then slowly nodded. He understood. There were details she didn't want repeated. Some memories belonged to the dead. He respected that. Yet the room already understood one thing. The woman sitting beside the broken crutch was not ordinary. Not even close. Rex shifted uncomfortably. The confidence he had worn all evening continued to fade. He tried to laugh. So what? She was a soldier. Big deal. Nobody laughed with him. Nobody even looked at him. The realization hit harder than he expected. For the first time in years, Rex Carter had become the least important person in the room. Frank looked directly at him. You still don't understand. Rex rolled his eyes. Then explain it. Frank nodded once. Fine. He pointed towards Sarah. 15 years ago, 9 Marines went into a mission. 9 Marines came home. Not because of luck. Not because of reinforcements. Because one person decided they were worth dying for. The sentence landed like a hammer. Emily looked towards Sarah. The entire room did. Sarah lowered her gaze once more. The attention clearly made her uncomfortable. Frank slipped the photograph back into his pocket. Then he glanced toward the front windows. Rain still fell. Thunder still rolled across the sky. But now another sound reached his ears. Faint, distant, growing louder. Engines. Several heads turned toward the entrance. Sarah heard them too. Her eyes closed for a brief moment. She already knew those engines. She knew exactly who was arriving. The distant growl of engines rolled through the storm long before anyone saw the vehicles. At first, most people inside Iron Horsebar assumed it was thunder echoing across the highway. Then the sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Every head slowly turned toward the rain-covered windows. Even Rex Carter stopped talking. The atmosphere inside the room shifted once again. The mystery that had been building for the past hour suddenly felt real. Sarah remained seated beside the broken crutch. Her eyes were closed for a moment, as if she were listening, not to the engines themselves, to the memories attached to them. She had heard that sound before, years ago, in places far more dangerous than a roadside bar. Emily followed everyone's gaze toward the parking lot. Through the curtain of rain, bright headlights appeared in the darkness. One pair, then another, then another. 3 black SUVs emerged from the storm and rolled slowly toward the entrance. The entire bar watched in silence. Nobody said a word. The vehicles moved with purpose. Not fast, not aggressive, controlled, professional. The kind of movement that instantly separated them from ordinary traffic. Frank Dawson saw them and slowly exhaled. They're here. The words barely escaped his lips, yet several people nearby heard them. Emily looked back at him. Her heart immediately began racing again. Who are they? Frank didn't answer. He never took his eyes off the parking lot. Rex folded his arms across his chest. His confidence tried to return. So what? A few fancy trucks. Nobody responded. Outside, the first SUV stopped directly in front of the entrance. The second pulled in behind it. Then the third. Their headlights illuminated the rain like silver needles falling from the sky. Engines shut down one by one. The sudden silence felt almost louder than the noise had been. Sarah lowered her eyes. Emily noticed it immediately. The woman who had remained calm through humiliation, through pain, through public cruelty, suddenly looked uncomfortable, not afraid, uncomfortable, as though she knew what was about to happen and wished it wouldn't. The front doors of the first SUV opened. Several figures stepped out, tall, disciplined, moving with the unmistakable posture of military personnel. They wore civilian jackets, but nothing about them felt civilian. Years of service remained visible in every movement. The customers inside the bar exchanged nervous glances. Even those with no military background sensed the difference. These weren't tourists. These weren't friends coming to settle a bar fight. These were professionals. Rex watched the approaching figures through the window and felt a strange sensation growing inside his chest. Unease. He immediately tried to suppress it. He had spent years intimidating people, years convincing himself he feared nobody. Yet something about the men walking through the rain disturbed him. One of his bikers leaned closer. "You know those guys?" Rex shook his head. "No." The answer came too quickly, too defensively. The biker noticed. So did Emily. Outside, the men reached the entrance but didn't enter immediately. Instead, they stopped beneath the awning, waiting, respectfully, deliberately, almost as though they were making room for someone else. Frank noticed that detail and straightened instinctively. Sarah closed her eyes. She knew exactly what it meant. Emily saw both reactions and felt another chill. Whoever they were waiting for was clearly more important than everyone already standing outside. The front passenger door of the second SUV finally opened. One polished black shoe touched the pavement. Then another. A tall man emerged slowly from the vehicle. Gray-haired, broad-shouldered, older than the others, but carrying himself with a presence that immediately commanded attention. Nobody inside the bar knew his name. Not yet, but every person felt the shift the moment he appeared. Leadership had a way of announcing itself without words. The man paused briefly beneath the rain. One of the younger men moved to offer an umbrella. He declined with a small gesture. Then he began walking toward the entrance. Frank's posture became perfectly straight. Years disappeared from the old Marine in an instant. Emily noticed and stared in disbelief. She had never seen Frank stand like that before, not even once. Sarah lowered her gaze toward the floor. Her expression revealed nothing, but her hand tightened slightly against her knee. The approaching figure crossed the final distance and stepped beneath the awning. The men waiting there instinctively shifted aside, not because they were ordered to, because respect demanded it. Inside the bar, Rex suddenly became aware of how quiet the room had become. Nobody looked at him anymore. Nobody cared about him anymore. Their attention belonged entirely to the man approaching the door. The realization made his stomach tighten. The handle turned. The entrance opened. Cold air swept into the room along with the sound of rain. Conversations stopped completely. Even breathing seemed quieter. The gray-haired man stepped inside. Water dripped from his coat. His eyes moved across the room once. Calm, precise, observant. They passed over the customers, over the bar top, over the broken crutch on the floor, over Rex Carter. Then they stopped, locked onto Sarah Mitchell. The entire room waited. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The man didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had finally found something he had been searching for far too long. Frank immediately stood at attention. Without hesitation, without thought, the movement was pure instinct. Several former service members in the room followed a second later. Rex stared in confusion. Emily stared in disbelief. Sarah slowly raised her eyes to meet the newcomer. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the man's expression softened. Not much, just enough for those paying attention to notice. 15 years, he said quietly. The room froze. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, because she recognized the voice immediately. The room remained frozen after the gray-haired man spoke those 4 words. 15 years. Nobody inside Iron Horse Bar understood their meaning, but everyone felt their weight. Sarah lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. For a moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. The years between them seemed to fill the entire room. Rain continued falling outside, but inside, every sound had faded into the background. The man stepped forward. One slow step, then another. The group who had arrived with him remained near the entrance, saying nothing. Their silence carried its own message. They were not the important people here. He was. Frank Dawson immediately straightened further. Instinct took over. Years of military discipline returned without permission. Then, in a voice filled with respect, he spoke the words that changed the atmosphere yet again. "Colonel Walker, sir." The title struck the room like a bell. Several former service members, sitting among the customers, instinctively sat straighter. Emily looked from Frank to the newcomer in shock. "A colonel. Not a businessman. Not a politician. A marine colonel." Rex frowned. He had expected someone important. He had not expected this. Walker barely acknowledged Frank with a small nod. His attention never left Sarah. The years showed in his face now. Not age. Regret. Gratitude. The kind of emotions carried by people who owed a debt they could never fully repay. Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was calm but tired. "You shouldn't have come." Walker's expression softened slightly. "I wasn't given a choice." Sarah almost smiled at that. Almost. Frank looked away. He knew exactly what that meant. If Walker had learned Sarah was here, nothing short of a national emergency would have kept him away. Walker took another step forward. Then his eyes dropped. He saw the broken crutch, the two shattered pieces of metal lying across the floor. His gaze lingered there, then moved to the torn jacket, the scrape marks on Sarah's hands, the bruises already beginning to form where she had fallen. Something changed in his face. The warmth disappeared. The gratitude remained. But now another emotion emerged beside it. Anger. Controlled. Cold. Dangerous. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Frank. Marines recognized that look. Rex did not. Walker slowly lifted his eyes and looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then he asked a simple question. Who did this? The words were not loud, yet they carried through the entire building. Silence followed. Rex rolled his shoulders and stepped forward. The old confidence tried to return. It was a misunderstanding. Walker looked at him for the first time. The colonel's gaze passed over him like a spotlight. Calm. Precise. Evaluating. Rex suddenly wished he had chosen different words. A misunderstanding, Walker repeated. Yes. Rex forced a smile. Just barroom nonsense. Things got out of hand. Walker looked down at the broken crutch again, then back at Rex. Out of hand. The silence became suffocating. Emily realized something extraordinary. Walker wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't threatening anyone. Yet Rex looked less comfortable with every passing second. Frank stepped forward slightly. Sir. Walker raised one hand without taking his eyes off Rex. Frank immediately stopped. The gesture carried decades of command authority. Walker returned his attention to Sarah. His voice changed instantly. Softer. Respectful. Sarah, are you hurt? The question stunned the room. A colonel asking a disabled veteran if she was hurt. Not out of politeness. Out of genuine concern. Sarah shook her head once. Nothing I haven't survived before. Walker closed his eyes briefly. Those words clearly hurt him more than they hurt her. Emily felt tears forming again. She didn't understand the full story yet, but she understood one thing. Whatever connection existed between these two people, it ran deeper than rank, deeper than friendship, deeper than military service. Walker slowly knelt. The movement shocked everyone. A Marine colonel kneeling beside a woman sitting on the floor. Sarah looked uncomfortable. You don't have to do that. Walker answered quietly. Yes, I do. For several seconds, neither spoke. The room watched in silence. Then Walker looked directly at her. 15 years, Sarah. 15 years, and you disappeared. Sarah looked away toward the rain-covered window. I didn't disappear. Walker's expression tightened. You disappeared to everyone who owed you their life. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Emily felt goosebumps rise along her arms. Rex glanced around uneasily. Every second that passed made him feel smaller. Less important. Less certain. Walker stood once more. Then he faced the room. His eyes swept across the customers, across the bikers, across the broken crutch, across the shattered remains of Sarah's evening. Finally he spoke. The woman sitting here is not who you think she is. The sentence froze the room. Sarah immediately closed her eyes. Frank lowered his head. He knew what was coming. Walker looked towards Sarah one last time. His voice softened. I'm sorry. Then he turned back to the crowd. 15 years ago, every one of us thought she was dead. The room fell completely silent. Nobody inside Iron Horse Bar moved after Colonel Walker's final sentence. 15 years ago, we all thought she was dead. The words settled over the room like a weight. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Sarah remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had spent years avoiding this moment. Years avoiding questions. Years avoiding recognition. Yet now there was no escaping it. Walker looked around the room and saw the confusion on every face. Emily, the customers, even some of the bikers. None of them understood why a Marine colonel would cross half the country for a disabled woman sitting beside a broken crutch. Walker took a slow breath. Then he spoke. 15 years ago, 9 Marines were trapped during an operation that officially never happened. Communication failed. Extraction failed. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. We were surrounded. The room became completely silent. Frank lowered his head. He had heard fragments of the story before, but never from the man who had lived it. Walker continued. We had wounded. We were running out of ammunition. We were losing men. Every plan had failed. Every option had disappeared. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. Except one. Sarah closed her eyes. Emily felt her heart pounding. Walker's voice softened. There was one person who refused to leave. One person who kept moving when everyone else had stopped believing we would survive. One person who carried wounded Marines through enemy fire, who kept us alive long enough to see another sunrise. A customer near the bar whispered, "My God." Walker nodded slowly. Most heroes are remembered because they win battles. Sarah was different. She became a hero because she refused to abandon people. The words echoed through the room. Rex looked increasingly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, but said nothing. For the first time all evening, he seemed afraid of drawing attention to himself. Walker continued. We told her to leave, ordered her to leave. She ignored every order. A faint smile appeared on Frank's face. That sounds like her. A few people gave nervous laughs. Even Sarah almost smiled. Almost. Walker's expression changed again. Then came the explosion. The room froze. Sarah lowered her gaze. The memory clearly remained painful. Walker looked toward the broken crutch lying on the floor. She lost her arm, saving one Marine. She lost her leg, getting another to safety. Yet she kept moving. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed capable of speaking. Emily felt tears running down her cheeks. Walker's voice grew quieter. By the time help arrived, 9 Marines were alive. 9 Marines came home. 9 families got their sons back. Because she refused to quit. Sarah shook her head slightly. Walker looked at her. You always hated this part. Sarah answered softly. Because it was never just me. Walker nodded. That's exactly why it was you. Silence followed. Then Walker turned toward the room again. Most of us never knew her real name. We knew a call sign. A name that became a legend. Frank closed his eyes briefly. The moment had finally arrived. Walker looked toward the damaged military tag hanging beneath Sarah's torn jacket. His voice carried across the room. Reaper 7. The room seemed to stop breathing. Emily stared at Sarah. Several customers looked at one another in disbelief. Even people who didn't understand military culture could hear the respect in the name. Walker continued. Every Marine in our circle knew that call sign. Not because it belonged to the strongest soldier. Not because it belonged to the highest-ranking soldier. But because it belonged to the person who chose everyone else's life over her own. Sarah looked away. The attention clearly hurt more than any physical wound. Walker took one step closer. For 15 years, people told stories about Reaper 7. Most thought she died that night. Some believed she never existed. Others believed she was a myth created by soldiers who needed hope. He paused, then gestured gently toward Sarah. She was real. The words hit the room harder than anything that had happened all evening. Emily covered her mouth. Frank stared at Sarah with open admiration. Several customers looked ashamed for having watched her humiliation without intervening. Walker's eyes became glassy. Then he spoke the truth he had carried for 15 years. Sarah Mitchell didn't just save 9 Marines. She saved my life. Complete silence. Absolute silence. Rex slowly lowered his eyes. Walker continued, I am standing here today because she chose not to leave me behind. Everything I became afterward, every promotion, every command, every year with my family, every birthday I saw, every sunrise I witnessed, I owe to her. Emily could no longer hold back tears. Neither could several others. Walker looked down at Sarah. His voice nearly broke. You gave us our lives back. Sarah finally looked up. Her expression was calm, humble, the same expression she had worn from the moment she entered the bar. She shook her head once. I just did my job. A quiet laugh escaped Walker. No, you did far more than that. The room sat in stunned silence as the truth settled over them. The woman they had seen as weak was a living legend. The woman mocked for her injuries had earned them protecting others. The woman sitting beside a broken crutch carried a legacy larger than anyone in the room had imagined. And for the first time all evening, nobody saw Sarah as a victim. They saw her exactly as she was. Nobody spoke after Colonel Walker's final words. The silence inside Iron Horse Bar was unlike anything that had existed there before. Earlier that evening, the room had been filled with laughter. Cruel laughter. Mocking laughter. The laughter of people who believed they were looking at weakness. Now there was only silence. Respectful. Heavy. Honest. Sarah sat quietly beside the broken remains of her crutch. She looked exactly the same as she had when she entered the bar. The same worn jacket. The same missing arm. The same prosthetic leg. Nothing about her had changed. Yet everything had changed. The people looking at her no longer saw what she had lost. They saw what she had given away. Colonel Walker stood motionless for several seconds. His eyes never left Sarah. 15 years of gratitude. 15 years of unfinished words. 15 years of debt that could never truly be repaid. Finally, he stepped forward. The room instinctively made space. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Walker stopped directly in front of Sarah. Then, without hesitation, he stood perfectly straight. Every former Marine in the room immediately recognized the posture. Emily felt her breath catch. Frank lowered his eyes for a moment. He already knew what was about to happen. Walker slowly raised his right hand. The movement was deliberate, precise, respectful. Then he saluted. Not a ceremonial salute, not a political gesture, not something done for an audience. It was the salute of one warrior to another, the salute of a man who owed his life to the person standing before him. The room froze. Emily felt tears spill down her cheeks. Frank immediately came to attention. Then he raised his own hand. Salute. One of the men who arrived with Walker followed. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, every Marine in the room stood at attention. Every hand raised. Every eye fixed on Sarah Mitchell. Nobody gave an order. Nobody needed to. Respect moved faster than commands ever could. Sarah stared at them. For the first time all evening, the calm mask cracked. Only slightly. Her eyes became glassy. She looked away for a moment, as if trying to escape the attention. But there was nowhere to hide. Not anymore. 15 years of silence had finally ended. Across the room, Emily slowly stood as well. She didn't salute. She wasn't military. Instead, she placed one hand over her heart. Several customers copied her. Then more. And more. One by one, the entire bar rose to its feet. The same people who had watched in silence, while Sarah was humiliated, now stood in silence for a different reason. Respect. Gratitude. Recognition. Rex Carter remained seated. For several seconds, he looked around in confusion. Nobody was looking at him anymore. Nobody feared him anymore. The power he had carried for years had vanished without a single punch being thrown. One of his own bikers quietly stepped away from the table. Then another. Then another. None of them wanted to stand beside him. Not now. Not after learning who Sarah really was. Rex swallowed hard. For the first time all evening, he finally understood what Sarah had meant. You will wish you had not. She had never threatened him. She had simply known the truth. Walker lowered his salute. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, but carried through the room. Sarah Mitchell, Reaper 7, on behalf of every Marine who came home because of you, thank you. No one moved. No one spoke. Sarah looked down briefly before answering. Her voice remained soft. I would do it again. The sentence hit harder than every reveal that came before it. Emily closed her eyes. Frank looked away. Walker nodded once. He believed her. Everyone did. Because that was who Sarah was. Not a legend. Not a myth. Not a hero seeking recognition. Simply someone who saw people in danger and refused to leave them behind. Walker then turned toward the broken crutch lying on the floor. His expression hardened. He looked toward Rex. The biker immediately lowered his eyes. Walker did not yell. He did not threaten. He did not insult. Somehow that made it worse. He simply said, the measure of a person is not what they can take from others. It is what they are willing to sacrifice for them. Rex could not answer. There was nothing left to say. The room had already judged him. Walker returned his attention to Sarah. Then, in a gesture no one expected, he carefully picked up the two broken pieces of the crutch. He handed them to one of the Marines beside him. Fix it. The Marine nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Sarah almost smiled. Almost. The storm outside had begun to fade. The rain softened against the windows. The night that had started with humiliation ended with something far more powerful. Recognition, respect, justice. As Sarah finally rose with assistance from those around her, every person in the room stepped aside. Not because they feared her, because they honored her, because they finally understood. And as she slowly moved toward the door, nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody mocked. They simply watched. The woman who entered the bar as a stranger left as something else entirely. A reminder, a lesson, a truth. Never judge people by what they have lost. Judge them by what they were willing to sacrifice for others. Sarah Mitchell never asked to be remembered. She never asked to be called a hero. She simply chose other people's lives over her own. If her story moved you today, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that true strength is often hidden behind the scars we can see. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.